Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance. The CFO role is changing rapidly, moving from cost controller to strategic visionary. And with every change comes opportunity. We are here to help you take advantage of this transition, to win at work, drive your career forwards, and lead with confidence. Join Hannah Munro, Managing Director of ITAS, a financial transformation consultancy, as she interviews key experts to give you real-world advice and guidance on how to transform your processes, people, and data. Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. My name is Hannah Munro, and today I'm talking with Matt Topham, who is the Director of Practical CFO Limited. So welcome, Matt. Fantastic to have you on the show.
Thanks for having us, Hannah. Good to meet you.
So just tell us a little bit about about your history and how you got into the role of CFO.
I think I've got a slightly unusual history, if I'm going to make sense, in that I had no idea what I was meant to do in school. I didn't do anything. And so I went off and did a load of stuff that included working for myself really early on. And essentially, that's where I worked out how somebody might make some money and how somebody would run a business. And then later, I ended up studying, qualifying, and going into practice and all of those things. But it all comes down to those things that I learned when I started. It's about how do you try and help somebody do something? How do you try and sell something? How do you make some money out of it? How do you get paid the money? And essentially, those really simple lessons that I learned early on are the ones I'm still trying to work out now. And those are the things we're trying to help clients with. Where do we make money from? How do we make it better? How do we take the pain away? How do we make it simpler?
And obviously, you guys work as a fractional CFOs. You work with businesses of varying different sizes. What do you think is the biggest challenge with being a fractional CFO in today's market?
I think the biggest problem is actually finding clients who care enough. And it sounds terrible. I think people really misunderstand what a CFO does, really understand what an accountant will do for them, what a finance department will do for them, and therefore the expectations are very mixed up. So I think the big challenge for us is trying to find clients who actually are trying to answer a question, who are curious, who are trying to improve. Because actually, if you want me just to do the numbers and send a set of annual accounts, I'm not the right person. Definitely not. Right? I mean, that might be a byproduct of the day job, but actually trying to sort out this afternoon's problem. And I think one of the really sexy things about being a CFO is actually it's a discovery each and every day, right? So you wake up in the morning not knowing the questions people are going to throw at you and work out, trying to work out how to work out what the answers are. And those might be tools and tricks that you've learned elsewhere, but it might be something completely blue sky, and you have to go and sort it out and work it out. So actually, it's quite interesting, but you've got to work with the sorts of people who have those problems then. Because if somebody has a very stable business that's doing the same thing, you don't need strategy, and you don't need insight, and you don't need amazing differences, because actually you're doing the same thing. Does that all make sense?
It does, and that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's less about do they need those strategy and those insights, but almost do they have the want to grow the business? You've got to have people that want to go on that journey with you.
And the want is really, really interesting thing, and I think sometimes we work very, very well with businesses that are high growth, and my history has always been high growth and Sunday Times Tech Track and all that sort of stuff. So there's on the one hand businesses who are trying to do something, who are trying to grow faster, who are trying to make it faster and leaner and smarter, but actually all those attributes of having lots of opportunities and not having any money, those look like turnaround as well. So actually, if you've got a business that's under pressure, business that's trying to get out of a terrible event or in a cycle of pressure, those are actually the same skills that we get with the growth stuff. It's right. Who can I pay tomorrow? What can I do today in order to make it better? What do I stop doing? It's about speed of decision making. It's also in a nice way, there's a lack of accuracy as well, right? So I think sometimes people are locked into, well, I can't make that decision, so I don't have perfect information. No, but you probably know enough. And there's this whole bit, this whole finance thing we struggle with, where you can have perfect information, but it's almost useless by the time you get it, right? Or you can have good, impactful early information that's going to be imperfect, but you can do something about it. And if you're a state of mind where actually you can take an opportunity, you can take enough of information, and you can have enough structure and enough inkling, I guess, that the information is good, then actually you can make decisions much smarter. I was going to say, actually, sometimes the smartest thing is not to make a decision, right? That's the hardest one in the world. But
Well, I find that really interesting because and I'm going to explore some of that, but in terms of like, should we make decisions? What decisions we should make? And I think that's the whole conversation itself. But I want to jump on your one of the points there because I find that fascinating because we talk a lot in accounting generally about materiality, but I don't find people applying it to decision making. They will literally wait till they've got the penny at the end of, that everything's given to them before they move forwards. And actually, that's a real key point, isn't it? Speed and agility, and it's so easy to kind of get bogged down and to avoid making decisions because you don't have the level of detail that you want to make that decision really safe. So how do you approach that, both with, maybe an existing accounting team that you're working alongside or with owners? Is that a conversation that you have with them, or is it almost something that you've had to get over yourself personally?
it was definitely something I've had to get over personally. And I remember sitting down in 20 years ago in practice and doing somebody's books, and somebody saying, you're getting lost in the detail. Right. And I was definitely that person. I couldn't see what was going on. I couldn't quite see, couldn't quite see where I went from there. I think the tricky bit here is some of this is actually just good old fashioned experience, right? And
Mm,
some of the businesses we've looked after, or some of the businesses I've looked after as an employee, went through some terrible times. Generally, I would like to point out there were external things that were done to us, but actually, they're remarkable learning experiences. When stuff's going wrong, do you know what? It's fantastic learning experience. And now,
mm,
years later, I look back at that stuff and say, actually, do you know what? Anything that I meet is probably not as bad as some of those situations. So
yeah.
on the one hand, there's a calmness and there's a lack of being phased by stuff. Somebody brings you something, and you go, mate, I can see why you think the end of the world is nigh, but actually, we've got a bit of time just to take a breath and just sort ourselves out. And that's learned. I don't think you can necessarily be trained into that in a short period of time. And it's interesting. I was talking to a competitor firm a couple of months ago who wanted to acquire the model of how to grow CFOs on a rapid basis. And I just don't think it's necessarily possible. I think you can be a really good accountant on a rapid basis, but that bulk of experience, those tools and tricks and tips that you learn from different places, the mistakes you make in different places, that's what gives you the spurs in order to try and make a decision. I think so on the one hand, that's about personality and it's about experience, but I think there is something that can be learned. And I think there is an approach that can be learned because actually I think it's KPI led, right? Because I think if you're starting to look at the big picture stuff and if you're starting to look at the themes, the story within the business, and I think the CFO is the chief storyteller because actually we're trying to understand what's going on in the business, whether that's in finance or elsewhere, and trying to pull that together into some sort of cohesive story about why we're fulfilling strategy or why we're pushing in the same direction. And if you're trying to wait until you get the last decimal space for to calculate a KPI, actually it's irrelevant, isn't it? Because aren't KPIs by definition broad brush? They are impressionable. They give you a view of where you're going as opposed to be targeted into detail. So I think it is also interesting that I see lots of people who are unable to process a KPI or unable to pull them together, particularly about sales and marketing KPIs, because actually I just don't know the answer to that one function. Not appreciating that actually it's probably okay to take a guess at it in the first instance and come back and colour in the detail. Because if you wait for it all to be perfect, back to your point, actually you're never going to make a decision.
So let's explore that. So, you're going into an organization that perhaps either doesn't have fully formed KPIs or is in the early stages. How do you approach figuring out what KPIs are important for them and what information you need to have access to start making good decisions?
So I think in the first instance, the three most important KPIs that we would worry about is first of all revenue volume, right? So you need enough sales. And so the growth of sales or the volume of sales is always relevant, and that's not a very hard thing to look at. There should be some, even basic invoicing that then says this is what the first number looks like. And then actually, the next one I'm most interested in, and it's a really, really high level one, but it's one of the most powerful, is productivity, and simply dividing the gross profit number by the cost of the people in the business. Right? You don't need a long calculator. You don't need a big spreadsheet to work that one out. Right? And actually, it's one of the most powerful, and it gives you an inkling as to where the organisation is, and there are nuances. You can do other things with it. So I come back to our history is running things like software businesses, and I would argue that anybody running a software business is actually running two separate businesses. They're running an operational business that is about servicing clients today, and then they've got a whole dev team that is about building a product for tomorrow. So when we do the numbers, we disaggregate those payroll numbers, and I would have an operational number that then says revenue, gross profit, all the rest of it. But divide that gross profit number by the operational payroll number, gives you a number, and it gives you an idea of the maturity of the business. Now, it would also give you an overall view on where the business is, particularly against the benchmarks if you use the entire payroll number, right? But if some of the business is about investment and discretionary spend for tomorrow, just take it out, right? Because it's a complicating factor. And what we quite often find is that when we turn up and we start to look at that as a KPI, the productivity numbers are obviously tend to be reasonably poor. By benchmark, they almost look like consultancy businesses, despite investing significant sums into product. Well, hang on a minute. If the whole purpose of software is to run faster and be smarter and to be able to get greater throughput, get more revenue through at lower cost, how can you look like a software? How can you look like a consultancy business if you're investing a load in technology? And at that really basic level, that starts to pull apart the maturity of the business. It starts to pull apart some of the systems and processes, and it starts to pull apart the product strategy, which is a really powerful thing to have done from a really high level KPI, right? And that's a 10-minute conversation with somebody.
You mentioned benchmarking on that as well. So how do you, like you mentioned, what does a SaaS company look like versus a consultancy business? Can you take us through like what typical benchmarks are and what we should be thinking about there?
Yeah, so I think from a really, really, really high level perspective, I go back to productivity and I go back to overhead rate. So they are really, really basic KPIs, and very, very easily benchmarkable from anybody else, right? So you go and look at the accounts. I would, if I went to go look at a small company as a benchmark, you can probably work out what you think revenue is and what you think operating cost is and what payroll is from the notes in the accounts as opposed to the numbers, right? So you can do this even when it's a relatively small benchmark. You build up that little panel of information, but a high level productivity and an overhead rate probably give you a really, really powerful insight as to what somebody's doing, even down to things like average salary rates. If somebody's a bit bigger, they're probably publishing what their overall salary bill is, as well as the number of employees. You can start to gauge how senior the group of employees are. That's a really useful one. It's a little bit difficult. It's a little bit harder, rather, to see beyond some of those numbers, some really hard KPIs. And so this is where actually being fractional a bit, or having worked in practice for a bit, is probably useful, because then you see the desperate detail of lots and lots of clients. So when I sit down to look at some high level KPIs, I know what benchmarks are because I'm working with those people every day. And then of course it's very useful. I get my calculator out and I say, well, your productivity rate is 1.7 times, for example. Actually, we see routinely see in the market 1.5 is your industry. You're doing fantastically well done. Let's move on and think about something else because that's a win. Or actually, look, we see project businesses routinely with productivity rates of 1.5 times. So that's gross profit of £150 for every £100 worth of payroll cost. We see 1.5 times being routine is the number that you're pulling back, but you're a software business and you should probably be 4 times. What's going on, right? What's your average salary rate, or what's your processes look like? Or actually, are we desperately immature and we're still inventing things for the first time? And that's okay too, right? but you just need to be on the road somewhere and move and make some incremental improvements into being better and best. Does that make sense?
So absolute sense. And I think it's a really interesting, because productivity isn't a KPI that you hear a lot about, right? It's something, and we build a lot of dashboards for varying companies of all different sizes, and that's not something that we commonly get asked for. I think it's a great one. So what other KPIs should people be thinking about at that top level to kind of figure out where to dig deeper?
Right, I think there's a couple of interesting bits here. So I think some of this is about the KPIs you should use, but also the KPIs that are dangerous to use. So in agency land, as an example, a typical KPI is revenue per head, and everybody gets it, and it's really easy to calculate, and it's brilliant. But actually, if you think about the unintended consequence, is that you are disinclined to hire low-cost people, inexpensive people, because it disproportionately affects your number, and you only hire expensive people because actually expensive people tend to have higher billable rates, and an agency that increases revenue, but it doesn't increase profit. So what are you trying to do? Right. So I think it's a really interesting one. So one of the if you use productivity then, or gross value added, as using the technical name as we use it, actually you can start to benchmark that agency spend or that agency headcount more rationally. And I think one of the other interesting things that productivity starts to do, if you use it at this level, finance stops trying to tell people who to hire. You can say to operations, actually, I know you need a budget because we've grown and we're getting to the edge of our productivity rate. We're becoming too productive, and that is definitely a thing, right? We're becoming too productive. You better start hiring people. You better start thinking about it. But you don't. Often, I've seen finance say, "Oh, actually, we better go and hire X, Y, and Z because we're becoming, we're short on headcount." I think you look at this from a productivity perspective. You give a budget to somebody who's the expert. You let them get on with it because actually they're the expert. It's really useful. We do see the overhead rate being quite interesting, and so we have a slightly different. Oh, definitely a thing, right? But if you think about this, right? So we all focus on the lack of productivity, right? Where we've got too many people, or they're too expensive, and they're not creating enough. But there might be technical reasons for that, because we're trying to do something for the first time, or we're trying to build a pipeline, or a process, or a structure, or things, or regulations are changing around us. I think the converse of this is that so often, particularly in an early startup business, everybody runs around being super productive and and doesn't do lots of things that never happened. Right? Administration doesn't happen, and so you end up going up the productivity curve very, very quickly, but it's unsustainable. And what usually happens is you end up super productive, then something terrible happens, like there's a VAT inspection, and it turns out nobody's done the VAT properly, or there's a compliance thing, or HR falls apart, or something, and actually the organisation starts to panic and it hires a load of people to fix the thing, and you end up going up this kind of productivity curve in some sort of wiggly line where you end up super productive, unproductive, super productive, unproductive. It'd be a lot easier to be ahead of that line and go, do you know what? I think we're becoming too productive. Something's going to happen unless we spot what's going on. Let's work out what it is, and that's hire in advance. And then what happens is that you end up on the upper side of the productivity line, and you just maintain it. And if you come back to, if you are going to value a business, and this is most of what we want to try and do for most of our clients who are raising investment and growing, you wouldn't want a wiggly productivity line where you go through boom and bust. You'd actually want a nice, smooth, predictable line. So simply by getting that bit right improves your valuation, because you're more predictable, you're more scalable, you're looking more organized.
So you mentioned earlier the concept of overhead rate. Tell us about that as a KPI.
So we, again, like to keep it really, really simple. And I think the bit that's controversial is that we tend to look at all of the non-staff overheads and divide that number by the payroll number. Most people would probably look at an overhead rate compared to revenue, for example. We don't think that's necessarily relevant, not least that revenue is an accounting concept and payroll isn't, right? So what we tend to find, and this is based on having done it for years, is that expensive payroll require expensive overheads, and they're always in proportion. So if you have less expensive people, they have less expensive offices and less expensive expectations. If you have really expensive people, they have expensive offices. And I can tell you the answer is overhead rate is generally about 50% of the payroll. And if that number is substantially lower, then actually you have to start to worry about the scalability of that organization. So typically in startup land, for example, you might end up with people scrimping the garage scenario where people are just making it as they're going along and a couple of bits of wood for desks, right? Great. They might have an overhead rate of 15% of payroll, for example, but they can't scale at that. You're going to have to raise some money in order to go and do something. So actually, it's a useful signal. It's a really, really quick KPI to have a quick look at. But quickly, you get to the bottom of where's the operational maturity of that organization. Now, one of the interesting things that happened post-COVID is that overhead rate fell from about 50% to about 35%. But what we found is that whilst people have an overhead rate saving, actually they have poorer productivity because the chances are people working from home and they are having to have team days and take people out of the office in order to get together, in order to build a community, which is important. And no, I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying it's actually that's more expensive than actually having an office. So there's an interesting thing that's going on there that the overhead rate starts to signal the ability of an organization to scale, to hire more people, to grow faster. Or it might be a signal that the business is under pressure because it tends to be the first thing that people cut. Let's get rid of the offices. Let's not do that thing. Let's not travel. Let's not do that. No, let's spend less in sales and marketing, for example. So if you have an organization that is desperately struggling, you will probably find the overhead rate is very, very low, which is a warning signal to how much the organization is struggling. Does that sort of?
Yeah, so let's just explore that because I can imagine that rate would vary depending on the industry because you have more people-based
It doesn't.
organizations.
That's the weird
Oh,
thing. It
that's
doesn't.
interesting.
It is because you always end up. No, so I think the interesting bit is you might end up with a technology business that ends up with relatively few people for the operation, but actually it needs smaller offices then, and it needs a smaller T&E bill, and it's all of that stuff is within scale of the people, and so and I also come back to if you've got expensive people, they have nicer offices. So whenever we've done the number, it's remarkable. It's within scale. And apart from that drop during post-COVID drop, it's been remarkably consistent. So I think that it's an interesting thing. The only thing I would do though, if it's a B2C business, I would exclude sales and marketing from the overhead. And so
Mm,
and by B2C, I would say actually many B2B sales businesses have a B2C looking sales operation. If that's the
yeah.
case, exclude that from the number because it's not part of the genuine overhead rate. And then actually the benchmark's not 50%, it's 45%. But I tell you, that's what it looks like. It's fascinating.
That's fascinating. So even with because I would have thought manufacturing with all the investment in, you
Yeah, yeah,
know,
that goes below EBITDA, doesn't it? So all the machinery kit, all of that
mm,
goes below the line. So you know, I think there's an interesting issue there with other KPIs. So rarely, in fact, we drafted a business plan a few days ago with a local power generation company, and actually the first time I can almost ever remember I've got a return on capital. Right, and I don't usually bother because I don't have clients who have big estates, right? And these people have built power stations, so they've got a lot of kit, and so actually return on capital has become important for a client for the first time that I remember for years. What tends to be more relevant are things like sales and marketing efficiency. How do I find
mm,
clients? How do I win clients? You know, LTV to CAC I think is a hero KPI. It almost encapsulates the entire business in one KPI. Now, okay, it doesn't because it excludes revenue momentum and it excludes cash, but actually LTV to CAC tells you a huge amount about the organization, and it also challenges strategy, which is really, really interesting because it goes to the heart of, okay, what's my long-term value? Well, that's about the average order value. It's about my profitability. It's probably about my tax strategy because there's tax involved in the selling. It's about my stickiness and my repeat rate, right? So everything that is in the top end of the organization is in the long term value piece. And what's my customer acquisition cost? Well, that's about channels and it's about efficiency and it's about use of technology. Um, it's also about how do you use the technologies in order to have stickier customers and stop being in a commodity business. So one of the
mm.
clients we've been working with for a few years now, had, when we started to talk to them, they were effectively in a commoditized B2C business. And you'd say, how sticky are you? Why do your customers come back to you? And say, well, they're probably because they're used to us. Interestingly, 3 or 4 years later, that's a technology business. It's not a commodity sales business anymore. And it's now starting to talk to its competitors about selling its technology into its competitors because it doesn't want to be in the commodity business anymore. And that all started with LTV to CAC. What's my repeat rate? How often does somebody want to buy something? What's my profitability? Oh, actually, well, if you don't sell them the commodity, you sell them the technology, which they were building anyway in order to have a smarter business. If you manage to sell that as the thing, it's higher margin, it's stickier. It's got better valuations for your exit, and you're not actually competing against your competitors anymore. Isn't that a hero place to be? But it's all within
Absolutely.
LTV to CAC, right? And it's really interesting. And one of the other things we find, come back to you talking a little while ago about, so often people won't calculate something because they don't know a bit of the answer. So when we
Yeah.
calculate LTV to CAC with a new client, we'll actually state all of the calculations line by line, so everybody's clear, right? And often something like customer lifetime isn't known when we turn up because nobody's ever done a cohort analysis. That's okay; it's not that hard. We do it, right? We're probably the last people in the world who should do it, but we'll do it. But we'll state all of those things, and if we don't know what the customer life is, actually we'll start with, what do you think it is? Okay, well, let's start with 2.5 years, then 3 years. If that's what you think it is, that's what we'll put in. We'll just state it as that thing, and we can come back and challenge it later. But if you don't do anything, you don't do anything. If you can do something, it's better than nothing.
And do you know what, that resonates? Because a lot of the customers that we've worked with, especially when they first start to look at numbers, that LTV number feels really, what's the word? It's almost intimidating to start calculating as a number. So you mentioned obviously making an assumption around lifetime, and how do you get around things like how much an average customer would buy in that lifetime, in that period? What are some of the things that you get around with, perhaps with assumptions?
I think there are two separate parts to that. So I think the first is you start with a simple assumption about where you start. And so if your average basket size hasn't changed for a long time, or it changes
Mm.
very slowly or long length of time, the chances are people aren't massively changing their buying behavior. So whatever your basket size is, whatever your basket size is. Um, Often we would end up with in a business planning exercise, we would make some real assumptions about known unknown assumptions about changing the basket size, right? Because it becomes part of the strategy. It becomes important. So you say, okay, I've got a basket size of X at the moment, but I have a strategic intention to make it 25% bigger, and I don't know what I'm going to do yet. But there's my business plan, and as I get closer to it, I can work out what 25% is. That's okay, right? You don't have it, this is not. I think the interesting issue here is that it feels as though there are people who have grown up auditing things, which is
Mm.
fantastic and it's a skill. I never did, and I'm not held by back. But if it doesn't quite add up, that's okay, because I'm trying to get the big picture right. This is the difference, I guess, between a technical drawing and a bit of impressionist art. The blobs are roughly in the right place, and that works for me.
And I think it's that sort of understanding, how much clarity you need in that picture to make a good decision in the first place, that actually helps you move forward. So finding, like you say, that balance, and when is good enough.
Exactly, exactly. I think the other interesting point, I think what you mentioned, long-term value. I think a lot of people are scared by long-term value because it implies failure. My customer only
Mm.
lasts a year. My customer only lasts 18 months, right? Okay, you are where you are. Just accept it. The question is what you do about it. So I think,
Mm.
you know, quite often then, um, owning the issue ends up meaning you have a bit of a chance of solving it. But this leads into the next piece then. That's not pretend every decision we make is perfect. That's not to pretend every decision we make is right. Let's just test those assumptions and be open to the fact it's a mistake. Finance is built on mistakes. That's why we have controls. So let's just think of those controls in terms of our KPIs. Actually, does this smell right? Are we growing? Are we running out of money? It's interesting that from a planning perspective, quite often people will focus on the profitability of a thing. This is what my unit revenue is. This is what my unit cost is. This is the profit I'm going to make. Okay, great, fantastic. Now tell me when you get paid or when you have to pay for something. That's a really interesting exercise because nobody ever knows. And it's quite often we turn up and people realise that actually they have to spend on all of their costs before they ever get paid. So the faster you grow, the faster you run out of money. Okay, that's interesting. How to challenge that? And often people have done the first bit and never done the second bit. So, back to owning the problem. Most businesses can't change their history. Just accept what you can learn from your history, and therefore what you can do about it.
And that's interesting. So it's not just about maybe the margin contribution that you're getting from an item, it's also about the cash flow contribution
Okay.
and how that impacts it as well.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Well, look, it's the old adage that cash is king, right? And so
Hmm.
in a perfect world, it'd probably be best to be cash generative and loss making, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? Because you'd end up with all the money and no tax. And in a perfect world,
Yeah, in a
right?
perfect world.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's the strategy, right? But I think it's an interesting one. But and come back to LTV to CAC. So we were working with a software business recently who had an incredibly long lifetime. We did a cohort analysis, and I think the lifetime is 6 or 7 years. Right? It's incredibly sticky. Then you restrict the value, and this is an ordinary thing that you would end up doing in the calculation. You restrict the income to a year, right? And actually, they have the LTV to CAC is sub 1, so they pay more to acquire a customer than they're worth in the first year
Mm.
because of the acquisition costs in the first year, right? The faster they grow, the faster they run out of money, even though strategically they're going to be hugely successful because they've got such a sticky product. Knowing that and then throttling your growth actually is the way that you manage to make sure you don't run out of money. But that's a really interesting problem to have, right? And we've come across that a few times over the years where actually growing too fast would become a problem. You'd end up owning a marketplace, but actually you'd end up running out of growth, or you'd have to, you'd have sold one to everybody, and the product life is so long you'd never sell another one, right? And it sounds stupid, but actually that's a real thing. And so insightful business planning and absolute clarity about how it plays under the metrics gets you to deploy in an operational fashion really, really helpfully.
Now, for the £1 million question. What is the best finance software for your business? Is it A, Sage 50? Is it B, Sage 200 Standard? C, Sage 200 Professional? Or D, Sage Intact? An impossible question to answer without a lifeline. But we have the perfect lifeline for you. Our free quiz, Which Sage product is right for you? Will tell you which product is the best fit for your business in just 5 minutes. All you need to do is head to www.itassolutions.co.uk and answer a few simple questions.
So you mentioned the throttling growth. So how do you figure out what's the right pace of growth for a business? How do you look at it? How, what's the process that you go through to figure out, should we slow? Should we speed up? What's the optimum?
I suspect the optimum is about affordability. It's about how much cash you've got, right? And I
Yeah.
think the tricky bit here is trying to look at where somebody's on the strategic journey. And we always think of company growth a bit like the 7 ages of man. You know, the one with crouching man and standing man and running.
Yeah.
Think of it on those sorts of bases, because actually, I think people forget they're on a journey and the business changes over a long length of time, right? If you're a seed business and you haven't proven something yet, going for massive growth is going to maximize your problems. Automating everything is going to maximize your problems. Nail what it is you're trying to do in an efficient fashion, right? Go and find some users who are using the product, then worry about monetization, for example, right? Be clear about what it is you're trying to prove at any one time. And so often we sit down with that seed business and they go, right, okay, I'm going to start billing people next week. You go, well, you haven't actually got any users yet. Should we see if people want to use your product and see if you've got any product market fit? And then let's think about monetization. Because if you're going to go to an investor, the first question is, who wants it? Are they prepared to pay for it? Is something else, right? So back to absolute clarity about what it is you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to, if you're going for your A round, for example, and you're looking for that £1 million worth of ARR, that's going to answer your throttling question. How much cash you've got today, and how much support you've got from assuming that business is probably going to be loss making, and it's going to need investor support in order to grow, you should be absolutely clear about what you're trying to get to, how long you want to be in that sweet spot of having the retained ARR whilst you're talking to your A round investors. So clarity of, and this doesn't have to be some amazingly complicated strategy. It just needs to be a whiteboard. It goes, right, who am I at which point? What are my deliverables at which point? What am I trying to do? Am I trying to go for revenue growth? Am I trying to have user acceptance? Am I trying to go to another country? Am I trying to? And there will be a parallel for every single business that's out there. And for many of those businesses, growth might not be the objective. It might be profit maximization. It might be for some of the, we work with some charities and we work with some social businesses. Growth is not what it's about. Profitability is not what it's about. Sustainability is really, really important. And then trying to maximize utility to the users. So clarity about what you're trying to do is the name of the game. How fast you can do it is how much cash you've got in the bank.
So let's talk about growth in that way. So thinking about, I guess, customer acquisition costs, right? Because I've seen some people do this really well and some people do it really badly in the past. And I think that's the joys of being a consultant, is you kind of get to look at it with an outside view as to what's going on. What's your view on how to do it well?
So I think the first thing is to be absolutely clear about what your customer acquisition costs are. That sounds bonkers, but usually when we turn up, somebody will use the media spend and use that as the customer acquisition cost. And they've got 20 people at the back who are all working sales and marketing, and they don't include those salaries. Well, they definitely part of your cost, right? Definitely. And that's one of the first things to have a look at, because quite often when we turn up, you've got an expensive team spend and a reasonably low media spend. You think, well, actually, if the balance was the other way around, more eyeballs would see the thing you're doing, and so be a smarter way to deploy the budget. But that's a sales and marketing problem. Quite often we see poor channel identification. Actually being clear about what your channels are, or even what the levers are in those channels. Now, I mentioned that commoditized business that that B2C business that we were talking about. That business had 2 channels. It never ever kept the numbers separate, so it wasn't clear about what its acquisition costs in those channels were. And actually, it turned out it was really, really close to a complementary channel that didn't have any the same sort of scale of acquisition cost, but it never really fed it. And because it wasn't really clear about what the channels were, it then couldn't quite say. It couldn't make that mental leap in order to say, do you know what, I should be selling to that channel, because in that channel I don't have such high acquisition costs. Whilst the margin per unit is lower, actually the contribution is higher. And so it's absolute clarity about that matrix that then says, right, who am I doing for whom, where? How do I attribute those costs into the right buckets? And how am I clear about what the contributions and what the repeat rates are that might be different into different channels? What the basket sizes might be into those different channels? And it doesn't have to be massively complicated. Let's put it into context. I think that exercise is probably 20 minutes a month that transformed that business from being where it was to, oh, actually, look at that, we're giving all that away. If only we did that. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I think that's a really interesting piece about thinking through the channels. And that goes back to your strategy. If you try and lump everything in, you can start there, but actually that sort of delving into the different channels, the different approaches. And yeah, I've never understood why people have a customer acquisition cost that doesn't include sales personally. But that's always something I find interesting.
It is interesting. I think there's also is having the right KPI for the right place in sales, right? So I think in enterprise sales, for example, the KPI is actually about channel management. It's about setting targets, and it's about managing the salespeople in order to try and get the right volume of work through. That's not enough to CAC. But let's not pretend the same exercise isn't happening. It is. It's just happening with a different mechanism. So I don't think the logic is particularly complicated. It just happens in a different place.
How do you approach a long sales cycle? You mentioned enterprise sales. Now, sometimes those sales cycles can be some of them are over a year. It's crazy. How do you approach and then you're spending on marketing meeting, the year before. So how do you approach the customer acquisition cost in those instances?
I think realistically, it's a question of not being an accountant and being a bit more broader brush, I guess. And this is back to, we talked about mistakes made early in our career. I remember we were running a mobile marketing agency a few years ago, and we used to hire salespeople, and we used to sack them after 3 months, and we hire another one and then sack them after 3 months. And you think, these people can't sell. What we didn't realize is actually it took 6 months for the person to get into post and build the network and start to sell effectively. And so actually what we were doing was just undermining our new salespeople with our crisis of confidence. And what I think you have to be absolutely clear about are the buttons within the industry you're trying to sell. So if your expectation is that it's going to take you 12 months to sell something, then the issue is to make sure that you're comfortable that things are moving through the channel successfully, moving through the funnel successfully. Are there and if you go and look at one of our business plans, our enterprise business plans start with how many people have you got? How many meetings do you think they're going to take? What's the first stage of the meetings, and how long does it take to get to second stage, and what's the conversion rate? And we'll build a channel up properly, and that's part of the financial plan, because it starts with setting some expectations about what we think enterprise sales look like, but it also gives you a tool to manage those people. We thought you were going to do 20 meetings this month, and you only did 6. What's going on? Oh, you couldn't find enough opportunities. Okay, well, actually, now we need an SDR in order to go and book you a load of opportunities. The issue is about trying to manage the channel, trying to manage the pipeline, as opposed to look at the financial KPI and saying, I'm spending 10 grand a month on that salesperson and they haven't sold anything. I didn't expect them to sell anything, therefore it's okay. I'm playing a long game. But do I have the confidence that that person is doing the right things? Yes, because they're being managed. Do I have the right KPIs?
So we've talked a lot about getting good KPIs, right, in order to enable us to make good decisions. I just want to flip maybe the conversation and say, once we've got good KPIs, how do we go about making decisions well?
I think if we've got good KPIs, decisions become obvious. And they become a bit more opportunistic. I think the danger with not having good KPIs, people don't quite know what decision it is they're trying to make. So let's go back to this enterprise salesperson that we've got. If we've got good KPIs, if we can see what other people are doing within the channel, the meetings rate, the conversion between stages, if we've got somebody who's stand out not as good, actually, that sounds like a trainee decision, or it's a bye-bye decision. Or to turn it around, maybe we've got somebody who's a hero that's actually stand out better than anybody else. Well, let's find out what it is they're doing so we can tell everybody else to do it. Right? So I don't think that becomes a complicated set of decisions to make, because the opportunity has now been presented to you. There is a very great danger, I think, in having, and I'm sure you've seen this, where people list 400 KPIs. Well, actually, you're just giving yourself a problem to try and solve. Work out what the 6 important ones are, the 4 important ones, right? And we haven't talked about cash, because that's fundamentally, that's probably more important than anything else. We can make a lot of mistakes if we've got a lot of money in the bank. And so actually, for most of our clients, we keep it really, really simple, and we're looking at runway. And we're simply saying, how much money is in the bank? What's your average EBITDA loss in a month? How many months you got less? And that then leads to your funding strategy, and your funding strategy probably leads you to the things that you need to achieve. So, for example, if I've made my promises to my existing investors that I've got £1 million worth of ARR by the time I next get to my next funding round, if I've only got 6 months worth of runway, I better make sure I'm doing it, or I'm setting some expectations.
Yeah, I think cash, particularly in SaaS, it's a big, it's something that everybody keeps an eye on, because you're always looking for that next investment round. But I think sometimes in more traditional businesses, you don't see as much focus on it, perhaps, as you should. What's been your experience around cash flow and KPIs?
I think it's interesting. You're right. So there tends to be a mentality in technology businesses that there's always always around the corner.
Yeah.
I think I think one of the practical issues that I found is that businesses that had too much cash tended to be lazy. And I certainly have had that when I'm in the real estate business I came to London to look after, was exactly that. It always had £6 or £7 million in the bank. And so the subsidiary businesses didn't really make a profit. It was they were never really under any pressure in order to go and do great stuff, because somebody could always bail them out. But then getting to the bottom of their numbers in a robust fashion, bringing in some simple numbers, treating them like an investment, actually started to sort some of that stuff out. But having too much money is a real problem on occasions, because the pressure to make a smart decision and quickly is just not there.
Yeah, the consequences aren't as impactful to making bad decisions.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's unusual there's a management team who has a lot of money in the bank who still has drive in order to go and do the really smart stuff. And we do have some of those clients. It's great. I mean, I'm working with somebody at the moment who has multiple millions in the bank and has made substantial investments in capex, but absolutely is worried about the recovery rate for B2C, for example, and getting paid by every single shekel possible is being paid. And that's not because they're mean, it's because actually they've recognised that their business deliberately is about really, really smart margins. It's about massive operating efficiency. It needs to be really, really smart at a profit level, and it needs to be paid for it. And if it doesn't do that on every single microtransaction, the big picture doesn't make sense. And that's the sort of culture I think you need in that sort of business.
So there's been some amazing takeaways from this session, I think, to both perhaps, a refresher for existing CFOs and also those new into role to really think about the levers within the business that you're operating. If you had to give a new CFO some top tips on thinking through, perhaps they're in a new role and the KPIs aren't established, what would be your top tips to getting into that initial KPI setting and decision making cycle?
So I think the first thing is absolute clarity about the strategy. Right? What are you there to do? What is it you're trying to achieve? Right? How does the business do its thing? Because I think the couple of KPIs will really, really fall out of that clarity. If you're trying to grow, for example, that will set an implication for a certain set of KPIs. If you're trying to be sustainable, it's different. If you're trying to go back to if you're running a charity as opposed to technology businesses, you're distilling what it is you need, what the organization needs, what your users need would be fundamentally different. And it starts with what's the purpose of the organization? Why are we here? What does success look like? Am I trying to exit in 3 years' time? If so, then what do I need to do? We'll work backwards, because those will then start to generate what becomes important. And conversely, and one of the things that we often go on about, I have mentioned it this time round, we go on about, it's really, really useful to know what's not important. Our view of the business planning is to tell you the 3 or 4 things that are important, but also what not to worry about. Because if you're a leader, you've got a million things going on all the time. Right, let's just take some of them out of your head. Let's focus on what's really, really important. So a really, really simple 3-statement cash flow, I would argue, is what every single CFO should sit down and do as their first exercise. It should lead into that strategy piece, but it should be absolutely clear about the operation of the business. And if you don't know how the levers are, then go and talk to the people who are organising the business, and it will give you the context and the experience in the business you've just joined in order to go and pull some levers, right? And if you get the business plan right, you're clear about what's important and what's not important, which means you can start to advise other people. Or you might recognise that the business is sailing off in the wrong direction and you need to start listening to some challenges. So I think I love business planning. Business planning is an amazing thing. It's incredibly, incredibly insightful. It's not something that's done in a darkened room by the finance bunny. It's an organisational thing, and if it's done efficiently, then everybody shares in the benefit. Quite often we do business planning by locking an entire management team in a room, because everybody shares everybody else's assumptions and view of the world. Oh, are we trying to achieve that? I didn't realise that we had an operational problem over there. Or I didn't realise that technology did this thing and it broke that thing. Or I didn't realise that I had a legal claim over here. Really, really interesting. and with big strategic differences, it also starts to set the priorities for which part of the organization will lead success in the organization. And that could be sales growth, or it could be technology efficiency, or it could be operational efficiency, or it could be. But they will end up being a hero something. And as a new CFO, actually trying to get that into a piece of paper is really, really interesting. Pulling some levers. One of my favorite functions in Excel is goal seek. I don't know if you ever use it. If you build your forecasts in the right way, go and do some planning. Go and pull some levers. Use the goal seek button in order to work backwards from what you need. Fascinating.
Amazing. And I think everyone is now starting to Google what is the goal seek function. So
Goal
we might put a link.
Fantastic. There's a skill to using it because you have to build the functions in the right way. But effectively, what you end up doing is saying, right, make that number the one I want it to be. And if you're trying to get to the bottom of, for example, revenue growth, think about that person who's just joined the organization as a seed plus and wants to get to A round, right? How do I get to £1 million worth of ARR? Well, build your forecasts in the right way. And it might be enterprise sales and conversions, and use your goal seek button to work out how many salespeople you need in order to get there. And that's a sobering thought, right? Actually, you need to hire another 40 people. Where am I going to find them? How am I going to afford them? How am I going to train them? How am I going to onboard them? Interesting.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Matt, for all of the things that you talked about. I think there's some absolute gold in today's session. If people want to learn more about you, your organization, where is the best place to find you?
So we are at pcfo.co.uk. That's probably the simplest place to go and have a look. We have some examples of some of the stuff that we do. There are some spreadsheets and things, or tips and tricks that people can download from the website. So, or indeed just grab me and ask a question.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Matt. And for anybody that's listening that's interested, I will pop the links that Matt has just mentioned into the show notes so they're nice and easily accessible. Thank you again, Matt, for sharing your knowledge and insights. It's been a cracking podcast, and hope to have you on again soon.
Good to speak to you. Thank you.
So for me, one of the most important things about any transformation project is the partners that you work with. And whilst I'd love to list off a whole host of reasons why ITAS is the perfect partner for your transformation project, why don't I let our customers do the talking for us?
One really good thing working with ITAS is it's dramatically reduced my blood pressure. Obviously, an account system is critical to anyone's business, so innovation data, without that, like every company, we couldn't function as a company. So it's one of the most critical pieces of software, and any sort of vulnerability we have with that sort of keeps you awake at night. And now working with ITAS, I don't have any concerns about our accounts functionality and our account system and the usability and all of that. Working with previous partners, I've got some grey hairs and sleepless nights from that, as I say, because it's so critical. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and long may the relationship continue.